Oh yeah. Just take a look at that beautiful graphic design, walking through every step along the path of creating a character to inhabit the world of Pathfinder 2.
There are so many videos out there right now in the RPG YouTube space. So excited to talk to you about this brand new RPG. There is one common thread that I will agree wholeheartedly with among those videos, and that is that this is an entirely brand new kind of game. Pathfinder 2 is as different from Pathfinder 1 as 4th edition was from 3.5, as AD&D was from Whitebox. And as much as Pathfinder 1 was a refactoring and rationalization of all the bugs in the code of 3.5, it was fundamentally an iteration on the previous game, much in the way that AD&D 2nd edition was upon AD&D 1st edition, or how Mold They Cook is an iteration upon Holmes' basic D&D. And if we take that as a true postulate as we move forward into this overview, and if we also set aside the debate over whether Starfinder is an entirely new game, then we're left to the understanding that this is in fact Paizo's first RPG that is kind of built wholly out of new code. And my, what an edifice this game is. What does it want you to preoccupy your playtime with? What sort of tools does this RPG give you? Where does it stay silent to provide a fruitful void in which to discover the course of play? And where is it specific in providing choices and a landscape of opportunities in order to make sure that play is robust and interesting? And this is where I'm going to take a wide berth of difference from the other RPG YouTube videos about Pathfinder 2 that you might have already watched. Because the premise of this video is not to say normatively about whether this game is good or bad, which can only be a matter of preference for the person speaking it. Instead, this is my final analysis of where Pathfinder 2's priorities lay. If you listen to Jason Buhlman, of course, he'll tell you this.
At its heart, the start of that process is kind of the same, right? You're still trying to figure out what your story is, what tale you're trying to tell. We didn't fundamentally change the narrative of the game or the world.
But I believe it only takes a brief examination of Pathfinder 2 to discover that the priorities have changed. What this game wants to be about and where it spends its time saying words is a lot different than what Cook, Williams, and Tweet created when they made 3.0 D&D. And this is about where I'm going to drop the accent because I got a lot to say and I got to say it quickly, folks. So, here's the thesis. Pathfinder 2.0 has shifted its intent as an RPG rule set from the 3.0 posture of being a hybrid simulationist gamist system to being a fully gamist system. Now, when I say that a given RPG system is either gamist, simulationist, or narrativist, this is through the lens of Ron Edwards' big model, which goes back to the Forge, and there are a lot of people out there who will talk a lot of trash about the Forge, not in the least of which this guy.
Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in internet shipment.
But notwithstanding the opinions of the man from Uruguay, the fundamental premise of the big model is to analyze RPGs based on the design intent. More specifically, the kind of play preferences that are informing the designer's decisions as they design the game, to whom they imagine it will appeal, and then serving that appeal. In Edwards' big model, simulationist RPGs are built to serve a set of play preferences that are all about being there, being transported into the other world, being a world builder as the game master and attending to the details of the world, agnostic to whether a story will occur, representing the underlying social, physical, and magical mechanics of that world in a fashion that creates verisimilitude and one might call immersion in that game's world. In contrast, the set of play preferences among players who prefer a gamist style is described by Edwards within an essay entitled Step On Up, in the overt sense of a carnival or country fair sort of game. A gamist RPG, or more properly, an RPG that seeks to cater to gamist play preferences, is one that is focused upon providing challenges in play, in reinforcing the sense of accomplishment when those challenges are completed, and underlining the sense of tension about whether they might be. Now, the big model is seen among RPG eggheads as somewhat dated, or at least aged, and Ron Edwards has a much more laser focus in his current work on what's going on in actual play, and analyzing what people are doing when they're at the table. Nevertheless, I think this is a useful lens to consider Pathfinder 2 through, if you are considering adopting it as your fantasy role-playing game. Because lots of people play something like D&D at their table, and it's the different kinds of D&D that are out there, whether it's OSR retro gaming, whether it's 5th edition D&D, whether it's 13th Age, or RuneQuest, or any manner of other options, they all bring something to the table. They all place their priorities in different places. And so if the sort of taste that Pathfinder 2 is looking to cater to are similar to yours, then it's probably a good RPG. If Pathfinder 2's priorities are distant from your play preferences in RPGs, then it may not be a good fit. It might not be worth investing your time learning it and your dollars buying it. Now, this isn't to say that you cannot focus on verisimilitude and the feeling that your characters are really in this other world using Pathfinder 2. It's not to say that you cannot be a devoted world builder creating and constructing the clockworks, nor is it to say that if you want story now, you can't get it from Pathfinder 2. But I contend, here in this video, that Pathfinder 2 has shifted its priorities from its parent game. Not only has it dropped certain artifacts of 3.x D&D that were emblematic of the parent game's hybrid emphasis towards simulationism, but it's also picked up a great head of steam on the gamist direction. The choices line that you'll hear from a great many of the talking heads in the Paizo sphere is one side of it. But another angle is on the GM facility side. Rather than populating a world with magic items where they might make sense, or just sort of creating magic items that a world would create based on the logic of the world, now magic items are part of a rubric. They need to drop in a certain interval of time because the assumption is that there are characters that are leveling through Pathfinder as you go. It's your job to put magic items in the path of the characters attached to specific encounters that it's assumed that the characters are going to have. In other words, Pathfinder 2 is assuming that you as the game master are planning, nay, even choreographing a story by stringing together a series of combats, rather than by creating a world to be moved about within. And if you don't believe me on that one, take it from Jason Bullman himself.
One of the things as well is as you're going to go through your adventure and stuff, everyone loves loot. Everyone likes to get at least something from their adventure in some way, shape, or form, be it treasure, items, etc.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with giving people certain items in Pathfinder 2nd Edition throughout their adventure?
Sure. Well, yeah, right. I mean, after they finish fighting, all those monsters, they're going to want some loot because they're greedy, and as GM, I guess you should indulge them every once in a while. I mean, don't listen to me. But yeah, I think fundamentally, right. We wanted that process to be simpler as well. In first edition, you really could get bogged down with trying to spend every copper and give them interesting items. So for second, we just kind of qualified items with levels and then allowed you to just pick items of the right level to give out as part of the treasure for those encounters. And you kind of do it almost level by level. So when the party's 5th level, you have to give out X number of 5th level items, a couple 6th level items, and a handful of consumables.
Before we move on to a couple more examples of the sorts of slices of pizza pie that Pathfinder 2 is envisioning that you spend your sessions upon, let's contrast Jason's sort of reflexive honesty about where he believes the priorities of play lie with some honest and less honest comments from Paizo's own ad copy and promotional materials on their website about what Pathfinder 2 is all about. Easier to learn, faster to play, streamlined rules and intuitive presentation. Okay, so far so good. I would agree with these things. The ergonomics of Pathfinder 2 are much greater than Pathfinder 1. The faster to play one is something that I take issue with, not in the sense that it is slower to play Pathfinder 2 than 1, but simply that there's a lot in Pathfinder 2 that takes up time. And if the goal is to be faster, I'm not sure whether the game really achieves it. And that's where I devoted a lot of the analysis in the prior video, something that a lot of folks kind of heard in a way other than I intended, but it's the internet. What can you do? Endlessly customizable, the new system features the deep character customization to tell the stories you want, featuring your own unique characters. So this one is juxtaposing sort of two different ideas on top of one another. They're taking as a given that having a lot of options means that you get a story that is more precise or more tuned to what you have in mind. And I would cast some doubt on whether that's reflexively true. I think it's certainly true that if you have more options to further specialize your character and create something that is certainly more mechanically unique in the game's eyes, then you might feel more accomplished when you completed challenges using those particular options. To give you an idea of what I mean, The difference between a battle axe and a longsword is very thin indeed in many versions of D&D. They're both one-handed weapons, and they both often do 1d8 damage. But Pathfinder 2 goes a couple levels deeper with how these different weapons work. And it certainly does make it more complicated, and it also leads to a different feel of play when you're operating the rules and rolling the dice with the battle axe guy versus longsword guy. But whether that makes them more unique in a story sense is something that I don't think is reflexively true. I'm not saying it's false, but I'm saying taking it as a given is a tall ask. Take cooperative storytelling with your friends to a new level. Where will your next adventure take you? Now, this is one where I think most of my viewers on the channel will be aware that there are a lot of RPG rule sets out there which do take cooperative storytelling to a new level. Powered by the Apocalypse comes to mind most readily, and in some respects, even 2die20 system has the power within it to actually make storytelling cooperative. But Pathfinder 2 doesn't seem so much like a cooperative storytelling game as far as the rules go. There's nothing in the game to allow the characters and the players to shape the story outside of the abilities they get on a moment-by-moment basis to usually do things in combat. To contrast, I think an example of a cooperative storytelling power in 5th edition D&D might be the Sailor background's ability to summon up passage on a ship for you and your friends. What I'm saying is, these background powers in 5e are things that are really in the rule set that enable something like collaborative storytelling. They change the stuff that's happening in the game on a much larger macro scale than combat. I'm not saying you can't do collaborative storytelling in Pathfinder 2 and talk to your game master about what sort of game you'd like to do, and maybe even pick options as a hint about what you'd like to see next in the game, like anti-undead options or anti-giant options, for example. But is it really honest to call Pathfinder 2 a cooperative storytelling game when there are games that go out of their way and devote real mechanics to, in fact, enabling something like cooperative storytelling? Again, I'm not providing the answer to that question, I'm just asking it, casting some doubt. You can make up your mind for yourself. Next up is this lovely paragraph, which I don't take a great issue with, besides that it claims that you're making a sword and sorcery adventurer for Pathfinder 2. And I have to say that my perception of sword and sorcery is a far cry from the high fantasy that Pathfinder has been up to now, especially in the person of Galarian, the default setting and world for Pathfinder. So yeah, that seems kind of weird too, to say sword and sorcery. I tend to think of Conan when I think sword and sorcery, much more than I think of Ed Greenwin's Forgotten Realms. And then finally we have this claim that Pathfinder is a narrative role-playing game. And they go through a description, not unlike Powered by the Apocalypse, that to do the thing, you do the thing, in the sense that you describe your character's actions and then eventually a die gets rolled. But I think we know from our experience of Pathfinder 1 and 3.x that a game with this level of granularity when it comes to squares and bonuses and keywords and so on is definitely a place where the conversation of play ends up being preoccupied with discussions of those keywords and squares and abilities, rather than in narration of what your character does. I mean, there are narrative RPGs, particularly Powered by the Apocalypse, which demand of the player that in order for anything to occur, they have to describe what they're doing. And interestingly, the example of play at the beginning of the Pathfinder 2 rulebook does try to redouble people back onto that good habit of play, of talking in the language of the universe that you're playing in, rather than in the rules of the game, about what your character does. It's nothing so loud and proud as the exhortations that Vincent Baker will give you in Powered by the Apocalypse, but I think I'm going to give him a pass on this one. This originally felt kind of off to me, but then once I started to look at Pathfinder 2's rulebook, I'm okay with them making this claim, even if there are games that are much more narrative, and in fact cater to that agenda of play. It's called Story Now in Ron Edwards' big model. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get back on track. Let's talk about how Pathfinder 2 has dropped some of the simulationist pretense from 3.x D&D. Now, in 3.x D&D, a given sort of wall is either slippery or has a certain number of handholds or is wet, and all of this colors how difficult it is to climb a given wall. The numbers are tied to conditions within the world. In the case of some things, like a long jump, the number that you roll on the die actually results in a 1-to-1 correlation of what you achieve in the game's world. In the Pathfinder 2 beta, that pretense that numbers were tied to specific things in the world had been entirely dropped, and you were advised as a game master to factor DCs simply based on easy, medium, hard, and difficult, and those easy, medium, hard difficulties would shift as the characters leveled up. In other words, it was a perpetual treadmill. In the post-beta live release, things are walked back just the least bit. Instead, we get something which we're familiar with from other RPGs, where DCs are tied to the sort of expertise that's required to complete them, be it untrained, trained, master, and legendary. So at face value, this would seem to be closely tied to the fiction of what's happening in the world. After all, some tasks can only be completed by a master. But the meaning of what a master is completely variable in Pathfinder 2. There are level 3 masters and there are level 10 masters. Now, it does make good sense that a level 20 barbarian should probably be able to complete an expert law check, in the sense that he's been everywhere, man. But we are having to do sort of 2 levels of meta-analysis in order to rationalize what we're seeing in the rules vis-a-vis what the outcomes are in the game's fiction. Another place where simulationism is put to the side a fair amount in Pathfinder 2 is in the abandonment of monster hit dice for ordinary run-of-the-mill monsters. Now, in the past, monsters have had a number of hit dice which are not unlike the number of levels that player characters had. Everything in the world had this neat and tidy symmetry to it, where a level 3 entity had certain capabilities that a level 1 entity didn't, thus providing the same kind of one-to-one intuitive grokking of how the numbers and the rules corresponded to a fiction and a world. Now, this is something that was dropped going into 5th edition D&D, and arguably was also absent from 4th edition D&D. And for my tastes, it's one of those things that's been difficult because it makes the window of the rules more opaque when I, as the game master, try to use those rules as a means to be a world builder. In other words, to be there. The reasoning behind this rules change is the same for all of these games, which is that making monsters and statting them up and shoving all the different templates together and abilities to create encounters was judged to be pretty difficult in 3.x D&D. And so Pathfinder 2, 5th edition D&D, and 4th edition D&D all have their own answer to what they're going to do instead. But why are they making this change in the first place? And the reason is to make providing challenges and making those challenges more predictable and consistent in their level of challenge for the game master. The precept of play that encounter design and encounter choreography is a core GM skill. To me, that speaks louder than anything else. That step on up is exactly the sort of taste that this game looks to serve. I'm not here to say which taste among those in the big model is better than any other. And as much as we can take the big model to be something of a truth about game design, once you hit the table and start rolling dice, there are so many other things that come into play. So if you're already enjoying Pathfinder 2, this video is not going to talk you out of enjoying it. And in fact, in the course of making it, I've kind of talked myself into how I could find myself enjoying it. You may have noticed a couple of occasions where some of my hypotheses came out not quite as strongly supported as I thought they might have been. But the real aim of this video is for the sort of person who looks at Pathfinder 2 or is already playing it and is finding themselves not having a great deal of fun in the present or future. And it's just to give you a little bit of a primer of thoughts, words, ideas, and the sort of theories that have been used to say why a game isn't speaking to your tastes, and do it in a way that's articulate and maybe more polite than just saying, this sucks. Because I think that this game is a supreme achievement in so many ways. Just maybe not ways that are really one-to-one lined up with my current tastes in RPGs. Thank you. I am the Complex Games Apologist.